The air was thick with the scent of grilled steaks, over-perfumed relatives, and generational judgment as Eliana made her way through the grand arched doors of the Winslow estate, a place that seemed to grow more ostentatious with every passing year, as if trying to compensate for something hollow at its core. The annual family reunion was less a gathering and more a performance, where the same characters played the same roles, boasting, comparing, subtly tearing each other down under the guise of just catching up, but somehow, despite her quiet strength and the sacrifices she had made, Eliana was always cast as the one who hadn't lived up to potential, the one who drifted in vague ambition while others climbed well-defined ladders. This year was no different. She arrived alone, dressed in a smart but understated navy blazer and white blouse, her hair tied neatly back, makeup minimal, carrying nothing but her handbag, which held, among other things, the acquisition contract that none of them knew existed. She had driven herself, parked 2 blocks down out of preference, and quietly let herself in without the flair of honking arrivals or grand entrances. As always, Aunt Sylvia's voice was the first to greet her, or rather, note her presence with that familiar mixture of surprise and skepticism. "Oh, Eliana, you made it," Sylvia chirped, balancing a wine glass like a queen would a scepter. "We weren't sure you'd take a break from your internet business?" The pause was laced with disdain. Eliana smiled politely, said hello, and moved further inside, where the clatter of cutlery and self-congratulations echoed off high ceilings and polished marble floors. Cousin Jeremy was already in full swing, boasting about his promotion to VP of something vaguely strategic at a tech conglomerate no one really understood but everyone clapped for anyway. Stock options, corner office, and their putting. "Me in charge of the Latin America portfolio," he said to a group clustered around the hors d'oeuvres. "Honestly, it's about time they recognized my value." Eliana nodded silently as she passed by, not bothering to interrupt. She had learned years ago that speaking in these spaces didn't mean being heard. Her seat, predictably, was near the end of the long banquet table, after the cousins with children, the proper professionals, and the elders with stories no one dared correct. She found herself squeezed between an overly chatty 11-year-old and the dessert tables edge, half concealed by a massive floral arrangement. As plates were passed, laughter rolled over her like waves hitting a rock. When someone mentioned investment portfolios, she lightly commented that her startup had turned its first real profit last quarter. The response? A polite smile from Uncle Greg and a laugh snort from Cousin Melissa. "Well, I guess Etsy's doing all right, huh?" Melissa said, swirling her mimosa. "Maybe you can finally pay off those student loans." Eliana didn't flinch. She had paid them off 3 years ago, in full. But what was the point of saying that? No one really asked her questions they wanted answers to, they asked to confirm their assumptions. Her startup wasn't on Etsy, it was a proprietary SaaS platform that was now being eyed by 3 major firms for integration. She had signed NDAs thicker than Sylvia's makeup bag and navigated a year of legal landmines to preserve equity and control. But none of that mattered here. Here, she was still little Eliana, the quiet dreamer who never quite grew up. As the first course came and went, she listened as her cousins recounted bonuses, cars, vacations, and houses Jeremy had brought. A PowerPoint-style portfolio of his new condo. "Just got a Tesla delivered, too," he beamed. "You still taking Uber, Elle?" That got a round of laughter, even from her father, who meant well but often missed when silence would have been kinder. She just smiled. No one asked her how she got there. She had driven her own BMW, purchased in cash, but parked down the street to avoid exactly this kind of pissing contest. As they moved into dinner, Uncle Martin gave a toast to the next generation of leaders. He said, glass raised toward Jeremy, Melissa, and Derek. To those who dared to build something real in this world. The implication hung in the air like humidity, and not to those who played with websites and startups. Eliana raised her glass too, though her throat burned slightly, not from wine, but from the ache of being unseen for so long by the people who were supposed to know her best. She could have told them about the meetings she took with Valen Technologies. The weeks of vetting by corporate auditors, the negotiation tactics she learned in coffee shops, the sleepless nights coding and fixing bugs until her fingers ached. She could have told them that last week, she signed a $6.4 million acquisition contract that ensured she would retain creative control and transition into a chief innovation officer role once the merger closed. She could have told them that Forbes had reached out for a feature next quarter. But she said none of it. Instead, she passed the mashed potatoes. Because in rooms like this, silence was survival. She had once tried to explain her vision during a previous reunion, a naive 25-year-old fresh from pitching her prototype to angel investors, and been met with puzzled stares and an onslaught of unsolicited job offers at real companies. That night, she went home and cried herself to sleep. But that was years ago. Now, the tears had been replaced with determination. Each insult had become fuel. Each dismissal, a quiet motivator. She had built in the shadows, evolved in silence, and now sat with the kind of leverage no one at that table could even fathom. And yet still, they served her pity with the dessert. As cake slices were distributed, Aunt Sylvia turned with a feigned sweetness. "Eliana, sweetheart, I hear you're still working from coffee shops? I read an article about how those freelancers are all the rage these days, so fun to dabble in between real commitments." Eliana blinked slowly. "Actually, I signed the lease for a full-floor office last month," she replied calmly. Sylvia's eyes twitched. "Oh? With who?" "My company," she said simply. "It's growing faster than we projected." "Oh," Sylvia replied, clearly caught off guard but unwilling to relinquish the condescension. "Well, good for you, dear. Everyone finds their path eventually." Eliana smiled, but her fingers brushed over the edge of her handbag under the table, feeling the weight of the contract inside, the legal confirmation of every sacrifice. Every sleepless night, every moment she had believed in herself when no one else had. The rest of the evening unfolded like a familiar play. Someone spilled wine. The twins got into an argument over who was mom's favorite. Jeremy's girlfriend got too tipsy and started asking if Eliana had considered dating apps. At one point, someone tried to match her with a nice guy from church, because, "You're so smart, Eliana, but you've got to settle down sometime, you know?" Through it all, Eliana remained gracious, nodding, smiling, letting it all roll off her like mist over armor. Because she knew something none of them did, that the next time they Googled her name, it would appear next to headlines they couldn't ignore. That by the next reunion, she'd be the one they whispered about in awe rather than ridicule. But most of all, she knew that their opinions had finally lost their power. The girl at the end of the table, tucked away behind flowers and forgotten between courses, was now the one holding the future in her bag, and they had no idea. As night fell and the group began drifting toward the fire pit outside, someone offered cigars, and someone else turned up the music. Eliana stood up, her legs slightly stiff, her handbag in hand. She walked past her cousins without pausing, past the kitchen where the caterers laughed among themselves, and paused at the front door. Her reflection caught in the glass, a woman no longer small, no longer overlooked. Just before stepping out, she turned back. No one noticed her leaving. And that was fine. Because next time, she wouldn't be seated at the end of the table. She'd be at the head, or better yet, she'd own the table entirely. Long before the ink dried on the contract folded neatly in Eliana's handbag, before the reunion glances and thinly veiled jabs, there had been late nights lit only by the glow of her second-hand laptop screen, fingers trembling from fatigue. But never stopping, driven by a vision so clear it refused to let her sleep, a future where independent creators could earn without middlemen, where niche voices didn't have to beg algorithms for scraps, and where financial freedom wasn't reserved only for the loudest, luckiest, or most connected. It started humbly, in a co-working basement in a forgotten part of town, where the rent was cheap, the coffee was burnt, and the walls were scrawled with the hopes of other dreamers. The idea had struck her not during some magical epiphany but during a freelance gig helping a poet automate his newsletter payments. One problem unraveled another, and suddenly, Eliana saw a way to build a platform that didn't just manage creator content, but dynamically structured monetization tiers using AI to respond to audience behavior, intuitive, decentralized, creator-first. No one she pitched to believed in it. VC after VC smiled politely, asked if she had a technical co-founder, and said no. The bigger firms didn't even take the meeting. Too niche, they said. Not scalable. One investor chuckled and asked if she had a plan B. She left the cafe that day and sat in her car for an hour, not crying, just silent. Then she went home, wrote out her roadmap in full, and committed to building it herself. 4 months. She lived frugally, she canceled her streaming subscriptions, lived on stir-fried rice and frozen spinach, and sold her high-end camera gear to cover server costs. But the work was addictive. Every bug she squashed, every test that passed, every email from a creator who said, "This is what I've been waiting for," was a shot of validation that rivaled any applause she'd never received at family dinners. Still, she wasn't delusional. She knew the tech needed legitimacy, reach, and allies. That's when she found Samir, an indie developer with a sharp mind and no ego, who had also been burned by big platforms. He didn't ask her if she had a plan B, he asked for the Git repo link and got to work. Together, with a few more night owls they picked up from Twitter threads and Discord channels, they built version 1.0. When they launched, there were bugs, of course. One major crash almost wiped user data. Another release introduced a weird glitch where half the page turned hot pink. But through every hiccup, they listened, improved, and adapted. Slowly, traction came, not viral, but steady. Niche YouTubers, indie authors, and course creators started using the platform to manage payments and deliver content in a way that felt personal, streamlined, and, most importantly, profitable. Revenues ticked up. Eliana could finally pay herself, just a little. Then, out of the blue, an email landed in the "Contact Us" inbox. Subject line, partnership inquiry, urgent. She thought it was spam. It wasn't. It was from Virion, one of the biggest content distribution conglomerates in North America. They had noticed the uptick in adoption across micro-influencer communities. One of their internal innovation teams had trialed the platform anonymously and was now pushing for a meeting. Eliana reread the email 5 times. She didn't respond. For a full 24 hours, long enough to calm the adrenaline and call a mentor she trusted. That call was pivotal. "Don't go in with your hat in hand," her mentor said. "You're not lucky they found you. They're lucky you built something they didn't see coming." At the meeting, held in a high-rise conference room with a view of the bay, Eliana presented alone. No pitch deck. Just a live demo, raw metrics, and a clear vision. The execs asked tough questions, but by the end, their tone shifted. Interest turned to urgency. The acquisition offer arrived 3 weeks later. Not a simple buyout, but a strategic merger that would leave her with both equity and a seat at the table. She would retain creative leadership, oversee platform integration, and be given a full team, her team, if she wanted, to scale it under the Virion umbrella. The numbers were staggering. They offered more than she'd imagined. Her first instinct was to say yes. Her second was to make sure she wasn't giving up control. The negotiations were exhausting. Back and forths about valuation, non-competes, team protection, brand autonomy. But she held her ground. Samir and the others would be offered permanent roles. Her name would remain on the product. The brand would not be buried but elevated. She hired a lawyer, an accountant, and a silent advisor she'd met through a creator friend. Together, they combed through every clause. The deal nearly fell apart twice. Once over revenue split forecasts, and once when Virion tried to insert a clause that would have locked her out of future independent projects. She pushed back. She refused. And they relented. When the final version landed in her inbox, she didn't cry, didn't jump or scream or blast it on social media. Instead, she went for a walk in the park, let the weight of it settle. Then she signed. Just like that, The girl who had been called naive, reckless, and idealistic had built something so powerful it made conglomerates pivot. Still, she told no one in the family. Not out of spite, though she would have been justified, but because she knew the truth. They wouldn't understand until they saw it. Words meant little to people who measured success by resumes and real estate. She didn't need their validation. What she needed, she already had: respect from peers, gratitude from users, freedom to create, and now, the resources to scale without compromise. But despite everything, part of her had wondered, just a little, how they'd react. Would her father beam with pride? Would Aunt Sylvia choke on her Sauvignon Blanc? Would Jeremy finally stop calling her the artsy one? She didn't want revenge. She wanted recognition. Not for ego, but for the child who had once begged to be taken seriously and had been told to sit down, be quiet, and let the adults talk. That's why she brought the contract to the reunion, not to boast, but to draw a line in her own story. A moment of transition. A quiet declaration that she was done asking for permission to be taken seriously. That contract wasn't just proof of her success, it was a memorial to every doubt she had overcome, every insult she had swallowed, every door slammed in her face. In her world, it was everything. In theirs, it would be a reckoning. She watched them from her place at the end of the table, all of them laughing, sipping, trading stories of surface-level success, never once wondering what she might have been. Building while they dismissed her. They had no idea. And she liked it that way. Because when the reveal came, when the contract left the bag and landed on the table, it would be undeniable. And no one would ever look at her the same again. The sky outside the Winslow estate had shifted to a rich indigo by the time the final toast was proposed, stars faintly glittering above the manicured lawn where tiki torches flickered and cousins gathered around a stone fire pit, the smoke curling in lazy spirals while stories grew louder, bolder, and increasingly detached from truth, as they always did when wine outpaced restraint. Inside, under chandeliers that gleamed like accusation, the dining hall buzzed with the dull roar of self-congratulation. Eliana sat motionless, hands resting in her lap, her handbag nestled against her chair leg like an unspoken threat, her eyes scanning the room with a detached calm, noting the familiar choreography of family hierarchy, who leaned forward to be heard, who rolled eyes at inconvenient truths, who performed curiosity only to reload their next brag. Jeremy, of course, stood at the head of the dessert table, mimicking a corporate presenter as he recapped his EQ2 achievements, to a cluster of aunts and uncles nodding dutifully, unaware or uninterested in the layers of fragility underneath his bravado. Eliana watched as he mimed success, the exaggerated gestures, the careful posture, the way he emphasized foreign cities he hadn't spent more than 48 hours in but named like old friends, oh, and then in Sao Paulo. And it struck her how easily people confused volume for value, charisma for capability, proximity to money for ownership of it. But tonight, she wouldn't let that illusion linger. Not anymore. Because this year, she wasn't the only one who knew her worth. This year, the paperwork existed, notarized, legally binding, and backed by one of the most powerful distribution giants in the world. And it was time they saw it, not for her pride, but for her peace. So, when Uncle Martin clinked a glass to call for attention, preparing to give another cloying toast likely aimed at cementing Jeremy's place as the family's crown jewel, Eliana rose. Not abruptly, not dramatically, but deliberately, and her quiet movement pulled a ripple of attention before she even spoke. Conversations hushed mid-sentence, glasses hovered in pause, and heads turned toward the woman they had spent years forgetting to ask about. For a moment, no one said a word. Expecting, perhaps, a polite thank you or soft platitude. But instead, Eliana reached down, unzipped her handbag, and withdrew a sleek leather folder, its corners precise, its contents unmistakable. She stepped forward, each click of her heels on the marble floor a declaration. When she stopped at the center of the room and opened the folder, the sound of fine paper unfolding was thunderous in its own way. I thought, she began, her voice calm but resonant, that this year I'd bring something to share with the family. Her eyes scanned the room, pausing on faces that had laughed at her, dismissed her, or worse, ignored her entirely. Some of you know I've been working on a startup, she continued, though no one had truly known. What you didn't know is that it was acquired last month by Virion International. A beat of silence. The deal closed at $6.4 million, plus equity. I'm now Chief Innovation Officer of their entire creator division. There was a collective inhale, audible and sharp, as if someone had unplugged the room's illusion of hierarchy. Jeremy's wine glass tilted in his hand but didn't fall. Aunt Sylvia blinked rapidly, her mouth forming a question that never found its shape. Uncle Martin's smirk cracked. Eliana stepped toward the buffet table and placed the contract there, letting the golden Virion logo gleam beneath the lights. And just to be clear, she added, glancing at Jeremy with gentle precision, the division I run now includes the acquisition of the digital rights management firm that owns the licensing to this very estate's rental agreements. And the company where Jeremy works. She didn't say it cruelly. She didn't need to. The truth had weight all on its own. Jeremy's face went slack, a dozen responses tangling and dying on his tongue before he managed, weakly, wait, what? Does that even mean? Eliana tilted her head. It means, effective next quarter, your department's tech stack will be transitioning to a platform I built. You'll be onboarding with materials I wrote. And every strategy meeting you attend will pass through my office before implementation. For once, Jeremy had nothing to say. For once, he wasn't the smartest guy in the room. The silence that followed wasn't awkward, it was seismic. A slow, dawning recognition crept across the room like fog. This wasn't just a success story. This was a reckoning. One by one, expressions shifted, from confusion to disbelief, from surprise to forced smiles, and finally to something quieter, respect, perhaps. Or regret. Aunt Sylvia's mouth twitched as if trying to summon a compliment, but all that escaped was a faint, well, darling, that's quite impressive. Eliana nodded politely. Thank you. She didn't need more. She'd stopped craving their praise years ago. Still, there was one last thing she needed to say, not for them, but for herself. I used to come to these reunions hoping someone would ask me what I was building. Hoping someone would look past the job title, past the assumptions. No one did, but I kept building. Not to prove anything to you, but because I believed in what I was doing. And now, I get to build even more. She paused. So if you ever find yourself wondering what someone's capable of, maybe start by asking. And with that, she closed the folder, tucked it under her arm, and turned toward the door. Behind her, the silence lingered, thick with unspoken apologies, buried comparisons, and years of misunderstood potential finally rising like steam from a long-suppressed boil. As she exited the estate's grand hall and stepped into the cool night, a black sedan pulled up, her driver, arranged by her assistant earlier that day, just in case she didn't feel like driving home. The door opened. She slipped inside, closed it behind her, and as the car pulled away, she glanced once over her shoulder, not in bitterness, not even in triumph, but in peace. Because for the first time in her life, she hadn't had to raise her voice to be heard. She had let the truth speak, and it had spoken loudly. In that final moment, as the estate faded behind her and the stars shimmered just a little brighter above, Eliana realized that she didn't just own a company now. She owned her story. And not one person in that house could take it from her again.